Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Medical Devices Australian Market Entry webinar. I'm Kirsty Amland from Medtech Consulting, and with me today I have Sarah Griffin from MedTechnique Consulting. And we're both really looking forward to speaking with you this morning or this afternoon, if you're dialing in from elsewhere, about how to create a successful market entry strategy for Australia and sharing some of our insights. So in terms of format this morning, I'll kick things off with a discussion around the Australian healthcare environment, considerations for assessing the commercial opportunity for medical devices that Australia presents, and then some tips on building a strategy to leverage those opportunities. And then I'll hand over to Sarah, who'll take a deeper dive into the reimbursement and funding pathways and share her expertise around preparing a health technology assessment. And we'll have a good amount of time at the end allocated to answer any questions from yourselves in the audience. So as we go, please write your questions down in the Q&A. There's a little a box you should have down at the bottom of your screen with Q&A. Pop your questions in there and we can answer those at the end. And if we haven't got time for all the questions, we do have everyone's details from your registration, so we can contact you and answer your questions that way. And we'll also put the recording of the webinar up on our websites. And if you have any issues along the way, we've got Kim in the background who is making sure things run smoothly. So if you have issues, pop those in the chat and Kim can help you there. So just before we get started, a bit about me and my background. I have over 20 years experience in the medical device field in the Australian market, working in industry in commercial roles where I've been responsible for assessing market opportunities and developing and executing on strategies to bring innovative medical technologies to market. I've launched a lot of products across many different therapeutic areas, and in a large multinational environment, but also in startup environments. So I've sort of done the gamut. And now I consult to companies looking to enter or launch new products into the Australian market. And they can be big foreign multinationals or local or overseas startups as well. So before you do anything, the first question to answer is really whether you should launch your medical device into the Australian market. A lot of companies immediately think that Australia may be too small of a market to bother with. But there are a lot of good reasons why you should at least evaluate the opportunity in Australia. It's a well-developed market. It's really well funded, both publicly and privately. And it has favourable demographics like an ageing population, long life expectancies, and increasing incidence of chronic diseases, like most developed markets. The regulatory environment is robust, it's transparent, it's pretty efficient, and there's a fairly sophisticated clinical environment here. So, you know, we have globally respected clinicians who are typically early adopters of new technology, and there's pretty widespread use of technologically advanced medical devices and diagnostics in Australia. And another thing to think about is because of our proximity to Asia, Australia can act as a bit of a gateway to that market. The geographic proximity means that Australia can be a good base for the region, and you can leverage infrastructure here and KOL relationships across the Asia-Pac region. There are also some financial fundamentals that make Australia attractive. There's a very high government investment in the public health system here. 70% of the total healthcare budget is spent in the public system. And we also have a well-funded private hospital system. And as a result of that, a really high percentage of GDP is spent on health. The key question many companies ask is really, does the size of the market opportunity justify an Australian presence? And it's important to do the work to evaluate the size of that opportunity, but there may, beyond the size, there may be strategic reasons why you'd want to launch here. Australia can be a good pilot site for new product introduction because it has that high level of regulatory oversight, a good clinical trials infrastructure, great access to key opinion leaders, and you know, I've seen it used really successfully as a good market environment to trial a new product and gather clinical feedback, acting as a bit of a proxy for US or European market launches, and it really allows you to fine-tune your sales and marketing strategies before you go into those bigger markets. The physical environment, our landscape here is really unique. It's a huge country, Australia, and it's roughly the same land size as the continental United States, but the population is a fraction of that at only around 26 million. And the population's quite scattered. So 66% of the population are in the 8 largest cities, the capital cities across the states, and the rest are sort of dotted around more remotely. And 40% of our population live in the 2 biggest cities, being Sydney and Melbourne in the southeast. And so this geographic diversity really brings some challenges to servicing a market like that, but also it brings opportunities. You know, servicing the regional and remote population that is, you know, predominantly publicly funded brings opportunities for products that reduce the need for patients to travel for treatment to the major cities. So things like telehealth, patient-controlled or remote-activated devices, or devices that move the site of care from the specialist to a local GP or even to the patient's home, have a real captive market. But on the flip side of that, on the operational side, supplying into a market this geographically spread can be really expensive and requires just some special consideration around how to reach and support customers in remote and rural areas, how to ship product around logistically. It's really hot in parts of Australia as well, so that can have an impact on how you get your product around cost effectively. So then, in terms of the system itself, the Australian healthcare system is made up of a number of subsystems that are managed and funded from different sources. The system's made up of, firstly, the public health programs, so immunisation and prevention programs, and then you've got primary health. So that's healthcare not related to hospitals, such as general practice, allied health services, pharmacy and community health. And the defining feature of this part of the system is that it can be accessed directly without a referral, whereas specialist services, which provide support for more complex health issues or conditions, require a referral. And this includes the hospital system, which delivers a range of services for both admitted patients and non-admitted patients, so things like outpatient services and emergency care. And it's really split into two main sectors. So you've got the public hospitals, which are run and funded by the government, so state and territory governments run the publics, and the private hospitals are owned and operated by both for-profit and not-for-profit providers, and funded by health insurance and private patient payments. And between that hospital system, the private and public sort of provide different services. Roughly 60% of surgical procedures take place in a private setting, with the rest in public, but the types of procedures that take place in private tend to be a bit different. They're more of the elective procedures, whereas emergency and complex sort of, things like transplant surgery would occur in a public hospital. And so where the care that uses the product that you're looking to bring to market occurs, whether it's in public or private, really impacts how you get your product approved for use, how long it takes, and what the mechanisms are for that. And Sarah will talk more about this, but who's paying for it based on where it's being used. And this really influences your market entry strategy. We'll talk about that in a bit more detail later on. So in entering the market with a new medical device, some of the common pitfalls for products that don't really get the uptake or the penetration that's anticipated is firstly that I think the market expectations or the opportunity doesn't align with expectations. So this can be because the size of the addressable market isn't really well understood, or the value of that market hasn't been correctly assessed, so expectations are misaligned. It could be that the value proposition for the product isn't there in the Australian market, it's different. You know, the key decision maker is different, or the clinical practice or protocol is different here to other markets where a company may have had success. Another reason is the competitive landscape. It's either not well understood, or it's, again, very different than other markets that a company might operate in. Then you've got the business model. So the business model is going to play a very large role in your commercial success, obviously, and choices around the right sales model to use, distribution, your local partners and operations can really make or break your launch success. And lastly, trying to apply a launch strategy that's worked in other markets just isn't necessarily a guarantee for success here. So it's really important to go through a robust process of strategy development to create a market entry strategy that's customized to the local market. So in terms of developing that strategy, the first step is really to evaluate the opportunity that the Australian market offers. I like to look at three key areas, you know, a client's product, the market or the customer being served, and the competitive environment. So for product, you want to evaluate the problem that you're solving, and does this problem exist in the Australian market? What are alternative solutions for solving the problem here? And what's your relative positioning, or what's the relative positioning of your solution versus other solutions that are currently in the market? And then in assessing your market, you're evaluating who your user is, who's the customer, and how many of them are there, what's your addressable market, and then what's your capacity to influence them or to influence the decision-making process, because there are, you know, as we all know, a lot of stakeholders in the use of a medical device, and it's quite a complex decision-making process. So understanding that pathway and making sure that you're acting on the right stakeholders is really crucial. And to answer a lot of these sorts of questions, you'll probably need to do some stakeholder research upfront. And then on the competitive, assessing your competitive environment, you're really looking at who or what is the competition. It can often be different here versus other markets. You know, there can be local players or alternative technologies that are available, or procedures that might impact a potential customer's buying decision. And you'll need to look at the competitive capabilities of the market players. You know, what's their business model, their strategies and strengths in the local market, which again may differ from other markets that they play in. And then the pricing, their positioning and relative market shares, all of those typical competitive indicators. So that opportunity assessment will, that work really allows you to make your market entry decision, you know, a go, no go decision. And assuming it's a go, it's going to guide your market strategy. And this is where you'll make decisions and put plans in place around customer relations. So, you know, how will you talk to your market about your solution? The channels that you'll use, so how you'll deliver your product to your customers, pricing, so how will your product be reimbursed and what's your strategy for that, what your pricing will be, how you get paid, and then on the capability side, so what capabilities do you actually need to make it all happen? And then the fun part, you get to the implementation and execution phase. So it can be tempting here to rush through the market assessment phase, you know, speak to a couple of friendly KOLs and make some assumptions around the market size and opportunity. But in my experience, being thorough here can save you a lot of time and money down the track. You know, understanding the market can really increase, can lower your risk. You're making a well-informed decision about entering the market based on the viability for your product. Doing this work really informs and validates your strategy, making the whole strategy development process easier and more efficient. And it can save you time and cost on the regulatory and clinical side as well. So, you know, it helps you to make sure you're getting approval for the right indications in the market, you're conducting the right clinical studies to demonstrate the points of differentiation of the claims that you're trying to make here, or your value proposition. So it's well worth taking the time to conduct a robust market entry strategy or market assessment, sorry, to set yourself up for your strategy. So to go to market, you want to answer 3 key questions. So firstly, how do we talk to our market about our solution? And then how do we deliver our product to our customers, and what capabilities do we need to do this? And so you can see here the key elements of a typical MedTech strategy, a medical device go-to-market strategy. And, you know, these include things like your sales channels, your pricing and reimbursement, your marketing strategy, and clinical and regulatory pathways. And underlying all that will be the activities that you need to conduct to execute the strategy, and the resources you'll need and the partners you'll need to engage with. And there are some big choices to be made around how you're going to reach your customer. I just wanted to spend a little bit of time here. You've got the decision to make around whether to go direct with your own sales force and distribution, or whether to use a distributor or some sort of a hybrid model. And going direct can be quite expensive in Australia. The geography means that sales reps usually need to travel a lot to cover very large territories, which is a big expense. Although now that we're all getting used to Zoom meetings, I think, you know, that landscape's changing a little bit. But case support can be very expensive. Australian reps also get paid very high base salaries, so much higher than in some other markets like the US. And you sort of need to ask yourself whether the sales potential or the breadth of the portfolio you're looking to introduce justifies the cost of going direct. But there are also some real advantages, such as the focus you get when you do go direct. You know, salespeople don't have competing products in their bag. You've got full control over the training, your marketing messages, and your ability to build direct relationships with your customers and own those relationships long term. And I see lots of companies come in with 1 or 2 clinical salespeople, or maybe a business development person for a bit of a market seeding phase in the beginning, or do a soft launch into a pilot territory to kind of gauge the market and build that user base, or even do some of that stakeholder research in the very early stages before making the decision to go via a distributor or go direct. But then if you are looking at partnering with distributors, there are some considerations there. Distributors need to have the right quality systems in place. They need, because we are such a big, diverse geographic area, their logistics capability is really important. How they manage that, whether it's themselves or whether they go via third parties, whether you have cold chain requirements or, other logistics needs might be important depending on your product. And this can all have a really big impact on your cost structure. Your target market and channel strategy will also depend on where your treatment occurs, really, and whether you've got reimbursement for your device. So where do most of the procedures occur that are going to use your device? And if you're selling into hospitals, if your device is fully rebated on the prosthesis list, your strategy may focus on the private sector. But if your product's used predominantly in public, the product choice is often determined by committee or buying contract. The public hospitals tend to run tenders, and in the private, the decision to use a product is often a combination of physician choice and also agreements between suppliers and hospital groups. And so all of this takes a fair bit of thought and planning. In order to you often can't just launch it and get immediate uptake. You've got agreements to get in place between yourself and your company and hospital groups, and tenders to wait for. And so sometimes it can be a long process if you're selling into hospitals in particular to get all that set up and start to get uptake. So once you've identified your customers and where they are, how are you going to talk to them? So your marketing promotion is really going to be a multi-pronged strategy based around your messaging, around your value proposition for each of your stakeholders. And the best strategies have a lot of different touch points. As we all probably are well aware, the best strategies, peer-to-peer influence is really strong among clinicians. So building awareness and credibility through KOLs is usually really important. And this involves establishing your KOL relationships, maybe setting up a clinical ad board, sponsoring investigator-initiated studies, or having a publication strategy, planning for educational events, conference presence. Back in the days when we had live conferences, all of those touch points. And then you have communications with other stakeholders as well, not just your users. You've got your payers and even your patients, depending on the type of product you're bringing to market. So going back to your user analysis, you need to make sure that you're targeting all of the right stakeholders, and your messaging and tactics to reach them are appropriately tuned. I just wanted to mention this too, when you are talking to your customers. In Australia, there are some really strict guidelines around how companies interact with healthcare professionals and communicate with them. They're based on the MTAA guidelines and on the TGA regulations. I've listed a few there, but some of the key things are that from a TGA perspective, all claims need to be substantiated by clinical or technical studies. And if you say you have data on file, that has to be able to be provided within 10 days. That timeline may have even changed since I last spoke about this slide. But it's also worth knowing there are some restricted representations as well. Certain disease areas that can't be discussed or marketed. They're either restricted or in some cases prohibited. There's no direct or comparative advertising, and a lot of tricky areas that you need to make sure you're across when you're putting together your communication strategy. So last is your implementation stage. And once you enter the tactical execution stage, it's really important to track and measure the success of your strategy, what's working and what's not. You know, there are the standard metrics that you use to look at your market impact, like revenue and market share gains that you're going to want to track. But things like product adoption, how quickly your product's being adopted, customer usage and customer retention are really good to look at. Keeping track of how your marketing campaigns, if you're running any, are tracking, and just being proactive and collecting and collating qualitative feedback from the field, from your sales team or your distributor, and monitoring your competitors' response as well. And some of this data can be hard to gather, but you know, you can leverage the sources that you have in market and then be proactive in reaching out to stakeholders to gather more qualitative feedback. It can be a bit of a black box, but you know, it's worth making sure that you are tracking and measuring, because it puts you in a stronger position to be prepared proactively to pivot or to dial up what's working and dial down what isn't. And your strategy is always going to require tweaking to give you the best chance of success. So with that, I'll hand over to Sarah to talk a little bit around the reimbursement and funding side.
Thanks, Kirsty. I'm just getting my video up and I will share my screen. Just give me a second. Right, everyone's, is that good? Can you see that, Kirsty?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, Kirsty. It's so complex that, you know, I suppose it's really interesting that you have to really think about this stuff before you enter the market. I look at one aspect of this, but it's really such a holistic thing. So introducing myself, I'm Sarah Griffin. I'm the Director of MedTechnique Consulting, which is a reimbursement strategy health economics consulting group. I also have been working in medical technology for over 20 years and have been running MedTechnique Consulting over the last 8 years. And we work with everyone from tiny, weeny little startups to multinationals. So what I'm going to do today, it's going to be quite high level because it's an incredibly complex field that we're looking at. But I just want to do a brief overview of how the system works, what you have to think about, what are the main areas of where you find your money in Australia. So it's really important, and it's amazing how often people actually don't think about this, is where is the money going to come from to pay for your medical device when you enter the market. So even though we have a really well-funded system and, you know, most Australians are covered in most respects for their healthcare, it's very siloed. We have buckets of money and you have to find out how to identify the bucket of money that you may or may not get your reimbursement from. And there's different requirements for each bucket of money. So we have to look at both the public and private health settings and the mechanisms for how you get reimbursement for medical devices through those systems. You can't ignore that patients may be paying out of pocket for certain devices or procedures because, like all health systems, there is not enough money to pay for everything that every citizen wants. So there will always be things that are out of pocket. And the money may come from a number of sources. It may not be one source, and it may not be particularly specific to your device. So you may not be in the situation where you know you're going to get X amount of dollars for X numbers of your device. So first I'm going to talk about Medicare. So for those of you who are outside Australia, Medicare is a universal healthcare system. So it covers all Australians. So regardless of your employment status, your age, your wealth, any of those things, Medicare covers everyone. But on top of that, nearly half of all Australians also pay for private health insurance. But private health insurance is quite limited in Australia. It's primarily a hospital cover and limited what they call ancillary cover. So that includes things like physiotherapy, dentistry, some, appliances, but it doesn't include primary care and pharmaceuticals, which are covered by other parts of the system. So in Australia, consequently, we have a bit of a mix of public and private hospital systems, though while they give comprehensive care, they sometimes don't work cohesively between each other. So sometimes sometimes the money and where you get it from can be quite fragmented, and there can be lots of perverse economic incentives which you need to be aware of when you're entering the market. And these are not generally apparent on the surface. You need to do research. So just a brief, very bird's eye view of the Australian Medicare system. So first of all, we have what's called the medical benefits schedule, and I'm going to go through that in a little more detail. We have the pharmaceutical benefits scheme. So we have a single payer pharmaceutical subsidisation scheme in Australia. So basically any drug that is on the pharmaceutical benefits scheme, and it's by no means all drugs, you pay little or nothing for it. So for example, a normal person who may not be eligible for any welfare payments such as a pension or unemployment benefits will pay no more than $32 per prescription, even if that drug costs many, many thousands of dollars. So that's, it's a really generous scheme, but there are high barriers to entry. Oops, sorry about that, my sensitive screen. We have a public hospital system that's comparatively well funded by world standards, and any Australian citizen can receive free care in a public hospital. And we also have a aged care system that comes under Medicare, but we're not going to discuss that today. So first of all, I'm going to talk about the medical benefits schedule, because that's really the basis of the whole reimbursement system in Australia. So the medical benefits schedule is subsidised by Medicare, and what it is, it's a list of thousands of procedures and doctors' visits and medical tests and diagnoses that are subsidised by Medicare. So basically, if a procedure or a medical attendance is not on the medical benefits schedule, then it will be an out-of-pocket expense for patients. So it's really the foundation of the whole system. And the coding system, which we won't go into today because it's just too complex, basically forms the basis of the public hospital funding system as well, which we will talk about a bit later. So it's really important that when you're entering the market, that you have a look and actually see whether the procedure or the test or the specialty area that you're working in is covered by Medicare. And it's pretty, once you get used to the system, it's pretty easy to find that out. You just go to www.mbsonline.gov.au and you can search the Medicare item numbers. And once you get used to doing that, it's not difficult. So that would be your first port of call, just to see whether this particular diagnosis is contemplated by Medicare. Medicare is comprehensive, but it's not all-encompassing. And again, there's quite a high barrier to entry to getting a procedure or medical service included on the medical benefits schedule. So the MBS is the basis of reimbursement of medical services in outpatient centres. So primary care, you'll remember I said that private health does not cover primary care. It doesn't cover your GP visits, your specialist visits. It doesn't cover a lot of procedures such as diagnostic procedures that are in the community. It doesn't cover X-rays that are conducted in the community. So the MBS is the basis of all those things. We also have the public hospital system. So that we're going to talk about their funding system. That's also roughly based on the MBS schedule as well. That's free. And the private hospital system is very much based on the medical benefits schedule. So basically, a usual requirement for coverage by private hospital, private health insurance is that if a procedure is performed in a private hospital and you're going to be covered for it, that procedure must be on the medical benefits schedule. So basically, this is the first place to look. However, it's really important to remember that the medical benefits schedule is a fee for the professional service only. It doesn't cover the cost of the device. So this is just the first step. So for example, an outpatient procedure that uses an expensive device, the medical benefits schedule fee will not cover the cost of that device. It's different in hospital, but in outpatient services, it is a bit of a gap in the system, and that could mean that a patient is paying for an outpatient device out of pocket. There are exceptions, but it just depends. You have to research it to find out all the details. So how do you get on the MBS? We have an organisation called the Medical Services Advisory Committee. It's a government appointed committee, but it is actually independent of government, and their job is to advise the Australian Minister of Health as to what new medical services should be included on the medical benefits schedule. So their job is to look at new medical services and look at the clinical evidence, the cost effectiveness, the safety, the total cost, and recommend to government whether that service should be funded, and if so, its circumstances. And this is an incredibly rigorous and detailed and resource-intensive process to go through. But the thinking behind it is, and this is true for all governments and all countries, is that the money available to spend on healthcare is finite. So we have to make choices that maximise the benefit to the population for the least amount of money. And so it's very rigorous, but it's important to understand what the thinking is behind it. So I could go do a whole webinar on the MSAC processes and still not cover anything, but I'll just give you a high level. So basically, it's a critical appraisal of the best available evidence to support a new medical procedure, which may encompass a new medical device, including subgroup analysis. So they're looking for which group of people that this intervention might be the most effective in. It's heavily reliant on high quality randomized controlled trials. So the evidence base for your intervention or medical device is extremely important. So it requires a full economic model, a full budget impact analysis, an examination of access and equity issues, which are very important in Australia because of our geography, and there's a lot of inequities because of the remoteness of some of our populations, so you have to explore all that. These applications are very resource and time intensive. They take a group of very skilled people, and it generally takes 2 years. So you don't enter into them lightly. So you need to be confident of your clinical evidence. And we always advise before you launch into this process that you get an independent assessment of your clinical evidence, an assessment of how likely that your application is to succeed. So putting that aside, as I said, that's extremely high level, but we're happy to give you more detail if you ask us some questions. So now I'm going to look at the public hospital system. So remember, we have a public hospital system which is completely free to the public, and a private system which requires private health insurance. So the public hospital system is funded it's quite complicated. So it's funded from Commonwealth taxes, it's, national taxes. And we have a Medicare levy, which I believe is about 1% of income as a separate tax, which goes to fund public hospital systems. But public hospitals are also funded by state taxation and importantly, are run by the states, not the federal government. So that combination of Commonwealth taxes and the Medicare levy and state taxation, that provides the funding for public hospitals. Doctors are generally paid by salary or fee arrangement within the hospital. When you go into a public hospital in Australia as an Australian citizen, how this is funded is completely opaque to you, because you don't pay anything, and you very rarely will you be presented with any sort of bill. So Australian public hospitals are funded on something called activity-based funding, which I'm sure a lot of people in other countries will be very familiar with. It's based on case mix, determining the mix of cases in each hospital. We have as discussed, we have the Commonwealth funding and state funding. We have a national health funding pool through which the money is distributed. How that is distributed is determined by an independent pricing authority, which has the great name of IPA. And the final distribution is determined by local hospital budgets. So how we classify cases is by case mix and with something called diagnostically related groups, DRG, and we have an Australian version of this, which is called the Australian Refined Diagnostic Related Groups. All of this is designed to provide sustainable funding to LHNs, which represents local hospital networks. So, for example, I live in northern Sydney, which is probably about 1 million people, and it's governed by a local hospital network, which combines a few, very large hospitals and some smaller hospitals, and the funding is administered through them. We won't talk about this yet, but what's very important to understand, we have something called a national efficient price, and I'm going to go into that a bit more deeply. But first, we have to understand what an ARDRG is. So ARDRGs are a classification system that groups episodes of care, whether they be an admission, or we have systems for emergency room admissions and rehabilitation, but basically it groups patients' episodes of cares or admissions in a clinically meaningful way, so that the episodes of care are grouped according to the clinical diagnosis and the type of resources that are used to treat that diagnosis. And we have a massive data collection program called the National Hospital Cost Data Collection, which collects these costs each year. It's highly detailed. There's lots of people dedicated to collecting this. So we have very, very detailed data about how much an episode of care costs and what the diagnosis and what happens to those patients in an episode of care. So a cost can be assigned. So the national efficient price is how we determine how each DRG or each episode of care, how much money that receives. How much, basically, you can think of it in a very crude sense, how much does a hospital receive for treating a particular sort of patient? So the national efficient price is basically the average of all our ARDRGs. So for example, an average DRG would have a cost weight of 1. So having a mole removed might have a cost weight of 0.01. Having a liver transplant might be a cost weight of 100. And basically we determine a price for that average admission of 1 cost weight. And for 2019-20, actually I should have done 21-22 because that's just been released, it was $5,134. So I I just cut out a number of DRGs so you could just have a sort of an idea of what that might mean. So we could have, they're quite broad, so we could have an implantation and replacement of an active implantable cardiac device. We could have a diagnosis of bronchiectasis or respiratory tuberculosis. And each of these DRGs would be assigned a cost weight based on the complexity and the resources used in that admission. And I've also taken a little sample of the National Cost Data Collection to give you an idea of how it all works. This is just a little snapshot. There's pages and pages of this sort of data. So like if we look at kidney liver transplant, I overestimated the cost. The cost weight is 29.597. So basically multiply that amount by that average, that national efficient price, and the hospital will get roughly that amount of money for performing that liver transplant. There's lots of weightings for, different types of, number of days of ICU or whether you're an Indigenous or remote patient. But overall, that's basically how the system works. So what does that mean for getting paid? So basically, there's no specific device reimbursement in public hospitals. Hospitals receive a sum of money for managing a case. How they spend that is totally up to their discretion. So what it means for market access of device is that basically as soon as you have TGA registration, you can sell into the public system. But, it's obviously more complicated than that because there's tenders, you have to get buy-in from the hospital, you have to get approval to use the device in that hospital, you have to get KOLs who want to use it, and it's far more complex. But in terms of actually accessing money, all you have to do is persuade someone to buy it. Generally, that's by competitive tender. But it's important to know that most innovative devices in Australia start their life in the public hospital sector because it's a really research-rich environment. It's where doctors are trained, they're attached, public hospitals are attached to universities. And so generally, innovative stuff starts in the public sector. For example, I worked a lot with transcatheter heart valves. They were in the public sector 5 years before they finally received private reimbursement. So don't ignore the public sector, particularly if you've got something novel, because this is probably where you'll get your start. And basically, any device that's able to, realising how public hospitals are paid, it's really important that you are able to demonstrate improved clinical performance or a reduction in the use of resources to be successful. So we've got to race ahead here so we don't run out of time. So the private hospital system, again, a procedure must be included on the MBF to be covered by private health insurance. Private health insurances are somewhat funded by the Commonwealth through a 30% tax rebate. We have private insurance. We have private payer excess, which is like deductible payments or out of pockets. But doctors get paid quite differently. They get paid under the Medicare MBS schedule and private insurance. And doctors in Australia are not constrained as to what they can charge, and quite often they will charge over and above what the Commonwealth or the private health insurers will pay, and the patient is left to pay that amount. So in order for private medical technologies to be funded in private hospitals, procedure must be included on the MBF. But over and above this, we have something that's reasonably unique to Australia. We have something called the prostheses list. So basically that means that implantable devices, basically something that you walk outside of the hospital inside you, receive a benefit over and above any other reimbursement. So this is really useful for implantable devices. But it also means that if an alternative device is not implanted, it may be at a disadvantage because the hospital will have to pay for that device. So the prosthesis list is a list of all medical devices used in surgical procedures for which health insurers must pay a benefit. Sorry about this. It's issued 3 times a year in February. That's changed. It's issued in March, July, and November. It's a bit of an exhaustive and quite complex application and price setting procedure. And there's a huge pressure on downward pressure on benefits like in every other country. And at the moment, it's under substantial reform. So there's quite a bit of uncertainty about it at the moment, which will probably be resolved somewhat in the new year. So to be on the prosthesis list, you have to meet certain criteria. You must have an ARTG number. The procedure must happen in hospital, and it must have an MBS item number. Otherwise, the product should be surgically implanted to replace an anatomical part or combat a pathological process or modulate a physiological process. So basically things that implantable devices that might be diagnostics may not be included on this. So takes for high-risk devices, you'll need 2 years of clinical evidence. So basically anything that translates to a class 3 medical device. If the device is considered novel or you would like a higher price than an existing comparator device, you'll have to go through a focused health technology assessment, and which you use conventional health economic analyses such as cost minimisation or cost effectiveness. And that process takes about 12 months if you go through a focused health technology assessment. Otherwise, it takes about 6 months. But again, I have to say this process is under considerable reform. There's going to be high pressure on prices. Some devices may come off the prosthesis list. So there's going to be substantial change in this area over the next 2 years. So it's definitely an area to watch because most device manufacturers are very interested in getting on this list. So there's other sources of payment that you can look at. There's the National Disability Insurance Scheme. So if you have a disability-related device, your patients may very well be able to get access to that through the NDIS. We have a National Diabetes Scheme, which includes all sorts of diabetes-related devices. And we have private health insurance ancillary cover, which may cover all sorts of odd bits and bobs, but which vary incredibly from health insurer to health insurer. And we also have patient pay. And I have to say there is a large willingness to pay in Australia for patients who can afford to. So quickly, because I'm running out of time, any questions? So I might turn it over to Kim to bring.
Yes, we do have a question in the Q&A to you, Sarah.
Oh, yeah.
So it is, could you please provide an example scenario where a device used or prescribed by a clinician may not be covered under the MBS fee?
Oh, well, that could happen to a lot of things because I can think of things that we're looking at the moment that they may be prescribed, they may have an ARTG number, but they haven't finished going through the medical benefits schedule process yet. Or I have a good example that something that's used in an outpatient setting that there's an MBS item number, so that I'm aware of, like ablation of varicose veins in an outpatient setting. The actual ablation device is not covered because the MBS fee is for the medical service, but the ablation device doesn't really have a reimbursement home. Did I answer that correctly? I might just read that question.
Sorry, Sarah, I asked that question and I actually got disconnected just when you started answering it, very inconveniently. I'm back on the call now, but I kind of cut out halfway through. I was just trying to ask about a procedure where if there is a suitable item code on the MBS where the clinician basically performs that procedure, but then it's associated with a device that might be too complex. I think that's how you explained it. It might not be covered under that item. So I was wondering if it applies to implantables, for example.
So you mean a device that's not an MBS item number associated with it, but it might be being used in the public sector, is that correct?
Yeah, so if the procedure has an MBS item code and then the clinician provides a medical device to deliver that therapeutic treatment under that MBS code, I think you were saying there were situations, or that's how I conceived it at least.
Yeah, it's generally in outpatient situations, because if you're in the hospital, you know, everything related to that episode of care in the hospital, in the public or the private, will be covered by either Medicare or your private insurance. But out in outpatient world, where you're going to a doctor, where doctors might do procedures in offices, they're only covered by the MBS fee, and the MBS fee does not encompass devices. So that can end up being a out-of-pocket expense.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question, which is, do you need TGA approval before promoting devices to market?
Yeah, I think that one's probably for me. And the answer is no. You can be speaking about devices that are in the, you know, that are yet to be approved, but you have to be very, very clear about that fact. So, you know, I think best practice is not to have marketing collateral out there before something is approved, but quite often part of that approval process may involve running a local clinical trial or engaging with clinicians on that device. So from that perspective, yeah, you can be in the market talking about a product that you're planning on bringing to market with clinicians who are your customer.
Okay, we have another question. Are single-use consumables only funded by the hospital themselves, used in theatre with MBS item number?
Generally. There are some exceptions in the private sector. So, for example, cardiac ablation catheters and surgical ablation catheters, there's quite a few of them on the prosthesis list. So they are single-use disposables. They're very high cost. So they're probably not considered a consumable like, you know, like gloves and, you know, just the general stuff that's used in an operating theatre, which would be covered by the hospital. It wouldn't be specifically reimbursed.
Okay, let me just check if there's any more questions that we have. If anyone has any that they'd like to add up, please do now. Otherwise, I'll just check if we've got any more. Let's see. One question. So what would be, that question is the length of time. What is the length of time to put through a reimbursement or a new product to market? What's the general time length?
Oh, it would depend what it is. You know, whether it, if something's come to market, all they need is TGA, and they don't need to, if there's something that you sell directly to a hospital or, there's no specific reimbursement process that you have to go through. It would just depend on the length of the TGA process. What do you think, Kirsty?
Yeah, and probably, and that process is dictated by the complexity of the device and your evidence and all of that. But yeah, I think it's, while you're going through that process is when you want to be looking at evaluating kind of the opportunity in the Australian market for your product as well.
If there's something highly complex that, requires a new MBS item number, and then you might need to do a subsequent prosthesis list application, I mean, that could take several years.
Mm.
And, they quite often you have to do a resubmission to MSAC. So, it can be quite lengthy. but it's completely variable and depending on the product. And that's why you really have to, you know, research it first so you know, because it is so variable.
Okay, well, thank you for that. Looks like we may have one more question. Hold on. Look here. No, that's okay. And looks like, oh no, we do actually. So we'll make this the last question because we're butting up against time now. So your thoughts on how the ongoing reforms will continue to shape the future opportunities for this sector?
Prosthesis list reform. Look, I think it's probably going to be a bit of a tumultuous couple of years as funding, you know, because particularly for things that may be coming off the prosthesis list while alternative funding mechanisms are worked out. I think even while there's a lot of pressure to decrease prices, that's going to have a natural, you know, plateau, which we're probably going to reach relatively, you know, within 1 or 2 years. But I think it's still going to be a pretty lucrative, solid market for devices in Australia. You know, it's such a sophisticated country in terms of healthcare, and there's certainly the demographics are right. But Australia has pretty much been seen as a cash cow for Asia, and probably those days are probably coming to an end. But it's still going to be a solid, desirable market for those types of devices.
Okay, thank you for that. Well, it looks like that's time. So thank you, Sarah and Kirsty, for sharing your insights this morning with us. And thank you for all the attendees for joining the webinar. We will be distributing an email after this to give you a link. We have recorded this webinar.